Welcome to Teachers Talk Texts, the podcast where English teachers share their insights and interpretations of texts currently studied in BCE English. I'm your host, Clare Mackey. Let's dive into today's episode. Hi Hannah, and thanks so much for joining me on Teachers Talk Texts to talk all things Ransom and the Queen. This is the first time I've attempted a comparative on the podcast. So I wonder whether it will take us twice as long to get through it. Possibly. And I thought I'll start, where I always start, which is, can you tell me what you love about the texts?
Oh, I actually think that's a really hard question.
Isn't that my job though? Isn't that the job of the English teacher to ask the tough questions? But
I feel like you should have given me these questions beforehand. Now I know what the students feel like when we bombard them with questions in class.
Right.
What do you think about this? I don't know. I think the thing that I'm liking most teaching these two texts are some of the ideas that my students are coming up with. So something continuously that the English examiners have been saying in their assessment, in their the PD, the thing that they do after the exams, is that they want to see students presenting their own ideas. And so something I've really been trying to do is to encourage my students to present their own ideas. And I say to them, doesn't matter how outrageous the idea might be, let us know what it is. Let's see if we can validate and support it. If we can't, well, we tried and we might come up with something else. If we can, fantastic, we've got another idea. So I think something that I'm actually really enjoying about these two texts, as well as exploring the idea of grief and the idea of what it means to be a leader, as well as someone who is a family person, is also helping my students validate their own ideas about both of the texts.
I like exactly what you're saying there, and I agree. The examiners report every year, year after year, which I think in some ways has motivated me to start this podcast. Has requested that students, rather than just regurgitating something that they've heard in the classroom or maybe something that they've read, they're really looking for, and as examiners are really looking for something a bit unique and a little bit outside the box. And it's perfectly okay to argue something that isn't necessarily the stock standard response that that maybe, or even the first thing that pops into your mind when you first read, on that initial reading of the two texts.
Yeah. So I was going to say, I think along with that, I think as teachers, and maybe this, I don't know, this doesn't need to go on the podcast, but I think maybe as teachers, we need to mirror that process of exploring an idea. So I know that in my classes, we're talking about symbols, and I might go, oh, what about this? Could we say that this is a symbol? How might we say it's a symbol? You know what? I'm not really feeling it. I don't really think it's, working that well. Or we might go with something else and it might work really well. So I think we as teachers also need to mirror that exploring of ideas and trying to validate it as well. I definitely found this year, so I didn't teach my current year 12s. I didn't teach them last year. And I just found that they wanted me to keep giving them the answers. They wanted me to keep telling them what it was they had to think. And I was like, because one of the things I love about English is tossing around all these different ideas. I love it when I do some sort of discussion based thing and students say something and I'm like, oh, I never thought of it like that before. That's actually really, really cool.
That is the reason, my favorite reason for being a teacher, is walking into a classroom with an idea about a text and a student saying something that completely challenges everything I've thought. Yeah, it's a wonderful thing and a wonderful aspect of our subject. We're lucky, I think, to have that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I think the skill of analysis and being able to present your ideas and explain your ideas and explain why they're valid, it's something that goes beyond English. It's something that goes into everything that you're going to do, whether you go into an apprenticeship, whether you go into university, whether you go into whatever occupation it is. The ability to go to analyze something and go, oh, well, here's my idea about it, and then to be able to present that idea and back it up is a skill that every student is going to have in or need in whatever they do after high school.
I agree. And what we're teaching in English is not so much just the specific content or the context of these two texts or of any comparative pairing. We're actually talking about something more broad, about being critical, reading beneath the surface, which I think perhaps especially at the moment is very important with the sheer number of reporters that there are nowadays. Anyone can be with it. You have a Twitter account and you're off. And we need to be critical about how we engage with text.
And that's where I know it's stepping out of comparative, but that's where the argument analysis unit is so important. Being able to, go, how are they trying to persuade me? Is what they're trying to persuade me of actually true and relevant? And being able to, seek the correct information for yourself.
I agree. I wonder then, I think in some ways what we're talking about does kind of link to the texts. In the thing I noticed in rewatching The Queen, which I did just over the weekend, I had seen it some time ago, before it was put on the text list, was how often, and because of the time period, so it's set in the kind of late night, like 1997, I think, is when Princess Diana dies. There's so many newspapers spread throughout the film. She's often reading the news. There's the news headlines. They're asking the Queen, have you seen the news today? And perhaps it jumped out at me because we don't consume our news in the same way anymore. But perhaps also was Frear's making some form of comment about the impact of the media on Queen Elizabeth in a way that she hadn't been impacted before, or she hadn't cared. Not cared, that's not fair.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? And I don't know if you've seen The Crown on Netflix, but I watched The Crown and it's so good. And I said to my students at the start, look, I apologize. I'm probably going to get confused with stuff that happened in The Queen and stuff that happened in The Crown.
Right.
But the Queen is interesting, and I feel a little bit sorry for her. I think initially, as we started to discuss the Queen, it was kind of like, oh, well, the Queen is so cold. She is so isolated. She doesn't know how to share her emotions. Like, I feel like initially we get this impression of the Queen that she's just this old fuddy-duddy who doesn't know how to, turn away from what she knows and go to something different. She's, you can't teach an old dog new tricks sort of thing. And I think the last couple of days we've sort of been exploring that a little bit more. But we've kind of been tossing around this idea, well, hold on a second. Like, yes, the Queen has admitted that she is someone who can't really show emotion. Like, that's just not her. It's not part of her character. But at the same time, we go, well, the Queen should be respecting the public. If the public wants to grieve Diana, then the Queen should be supporting that. But I don't think we actually really looked at it from the other side of, well, hold on a second. The Queen asked the public to respect their privacy and to respect that they were trying to grieve this. And in the Queen, a conversation she has with Tony Blair, she puts him on speakerphone and they're talking about what needs to happen, and she gets really grumpy and she picks up the phone. You know how we do that, we put it on speakerphone when we're casually talking, all of a sudden we're grumpy, we put speaker off and we're like, hold on a second, and she gets grumpy and she's like, well, hold on a second, don't think that don't think that I'm going to put the people's grievances over my family grievances, over my grandsons. And so the last couple of days, we've really sort of been challenged by, well, hold on a second, maybe the public was asking her a little bit much. Maybe it's the public who wasn't respecting that she needed to grieve, or maybe they weren't respecting that even if she hated Diana, Cherie Blair says that she hated Diana's guts. The Queen hated Diana's guts. And so even if the Queen disliked Diana, she still does seem to have that sense of, no, I'm here as a grandmother. Yes. I'm going to help my grandsons grieve before I help the public grieve.
Yes.
So that's something we've been challenged with. And as I say to my students, you've got to watch and reread your texts over and over and over again, because I guarantee every single time you rewatch it or reread it, you're going to get something new that you didn't get before.
Yes, absolutely. And that, would you believe that is a conversation? What you've just said there has been said, I think, by every wonderful guest teacher who's come on, and chatted to me. It seems to be almost a motif.
A recurring theme.
A recurring theme. Yes. So if students take anything from this podcast, it's just read and watch your text a second time at least.
Yeah. Previously, I've taught Tracks and Into the Wild, and I think I taught Into the Wild 2 or 3 years in a row, and so I watched it a few times, and like 10 times. Every single time I watched it, I was like, oh, I never picked up on that before.
Right.
Yeah. So definitely really important to reread and rewatch your texts.
I think also the second time, like even in me rereading Ransom, I read it, it was on the year 12 list, just as a list A text, maybe 5-6 years ago, and it's back as a comparative. So I've read it as a single text analysis, but reading it a second time through with the Queen in my mind, approach it in a completely different way, and thinking about the connections we can make. I think what you picked up though in this interpretation of the Queen, and that she's so, you know, traditional, and she's stuffy, and she's cold, it comes down to perception, and the perception that we as the audience have of the Queen, and the perception that the British people have of the Queen. And I'm thinking then about Ransom and the perception that is established of Priam. You know, he doesn't fall victim to that same expectation as a leader as the Queen does. And it's his own son that dies. And so then my brain, the English teacher in me says, why? Why is it that Priam, even though his son is being strapped to the back of a chariot and raced back and forth in front of, you know, by Achilles, but why is it that Priam is not, the same expectation is not placed on his shoulders? I don't know if
I think
you have any insights on that.
I think it's really interesting. Like, firstly, we've definitely got to look at the context. We've got two incredibly different historical contexts. We've got in Ransom the context of the Trojan War, which is our ancient Greek mythology. It is, you know, the part that Malouf retells is a part of Homer's Iliad, which is a retelling of the whole Trojan War mythology, which is, I think nowadays they say that the Trojan War is historically like a historical event. It's not necessarily mythology, but definitely we still have some mythology things mixed in with that. So firstly, we've got these different cultures and these different customs. Like in Greek mythology, or in the context of ancient Greek, it would have been so unusual and so unheard of for Priam, the king of Troy, the enemy of the Greek camp, or the enemy of the Greeks, to go to Achilles, who is leading the Greeks, the enemy, to ask for his son's body back. You know, that would have just been uncalled for. And Hecuba in Ransom, when Priam first brings this idea to her, this idea of chance, and Malouf says she dare not say his word, so she can't even say this word chance. And that, you know, we can get into also the idea of the gods controlling what they do. Yeah, so this idea that Priam would humble himself, would strip himself, as he says, of his royal sphere, step out of his royal sphere and try something new, is just completely unheard of. That's just not what you do. And Hecuba says, Achilles has been dragging your son's body like at the back of his chariot for the past 11 days. You have no idea what this guy is going to do to you. And so I think, like, firstly, just a bit of a side note, I think that says a lot about humility. I think it says a lot about someone in a position of power, or someone as a leader being able to humble themselves to do something that is seen as being beneath them. So we've got this really different context. We've got this context of war, even if we look at the Myrmidons and Achilles. So Achilles is breaking daily every law that they have been taught to live by. And the Myrmidons, though, they still love him. They still respect him. In stark contrast, I would say, to the Queen, the people, as soon as the Queen does something which the people don't agree with, all of a sudden, what are we, 20th century, they're like, hold on a second, we don't agree with that, we're not going to respect you and love you anymore. So completely different context. Achilles is their leader, the Myrmidons' leader. They're leading in a war. This war lasts 10 years. They're tired, they want to go home, they need to have that person to follow. Regardless of what the leader does, even if it's something they feel is wrong, they still love him, they still respect him. The Queen, on the other hand, she does something that the public doesn't see as being right or correct, the correct way of grieving, and then all of a sudden, the Queen's the bad guy, and they turn away, they don't have that respect anymore. So very different contexts. Also, I guess to 20th century monarchy, because we're still talking, in both instances, we're talking about a monarchy. Priam, I don't know, I kind of feel like in ancient Greece, the king would have had, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like in ancient Greece, the king would have had a more significant role than perhaps the Queen has today. I feel like the Queen today, even with us as Australians, she's very much just a figurehead. She's literally a symbol. She really does not do much. And even in the Queen, even in the movie, we see that ultimately, I feel like it's Tony Blair who has the power. You know, Tony Blair is the Prime Minister. He's the people's voice, in a sense, to the Queen. And yes, she says that the Parliament is her government, but I kind of feel like she doesn't really have much of a say. She's really symbolic. And I feel like the 20th century context of the monarch is very different to our ancient Greece monarch, where I feel like Priam would have been a lot more respected perhaps than the Queen. And so I guess if we're comparing Priam and the Queen directly, it is interesting because Priam really has no public motivation for doing what he does. His motivation is purely intrinsic. It's purely because, as he says, in the last few years of my reign, he wants to do something that is meaningful. He wants to leave a legacy. Whereas the Queen is purely driven by public voice. And so it's very interesting because in Ransom, we really don't hear that public voice at all. We could possibly talk about Somax as being a symbol of the public voice, and Somax is also Malouf's own fictional character. We know Priam existed, we know Achilles existed, we know his son Neoptolemus existed, etc. But Malouf has said that Somax is his own fictional invention. And so I guess we could see Somax as sort of that public, the symbol of the public. But I guess one of the major things that stands out is Priam does this intrinsically, is because it's something he wants to do. Whereas the Queen is sort of forced in a way to do something she doesn't want to do, that she doesn't feel is right, because it's what her people are calling for. And I think if we're looking at that as a point of comparison, we need to definitely be taking into consideration the contexts. I think 20th century monarchy, people, I mean, we're starting to be more of a democracy, aren't we? 20th century. And so people's voices are starting to be heard more.
No, I agree with all of that. And you've shed light on, there's so many things that you've talked about there in regards to context, in regards to the motivation, that intrinsic or extrinsic motivation of both characters, which is a really beautiful parallel. And even I'm reminded of the fact that, like you said, you know, Tony Blair, he is the one that asks the Queen in the film if she will support his government, and she says something like, no, Mr. Blair, I ask you the question. And that's such a beautiful representation of him not even really knowing the traditional rules, but he's still he was the voted in representative of the British people, which suggests therefore the inference is that the rules that the Queen is relying on are no longer relevant. And that it's just that tiny conversation, through that tiny conversation and interaction, Frear speaks volumes about the Queen and her power. I really like that, and then Priam's intrinsic motivation and the goddess Iris coming to him, you know, we assume in a dreams like state or an imaginative state, whether we want to believe that the gods and the goddesses visited people in real life. That's for us to decide. But
it's interesting though with Iris. I mean, something I've discussed with my students is she plants this idea of chance in his mind. And because she plants this idea of chance in his mind, it's like Priam is all of a sudden like, oh, hold on a second. I have free will. I can do what I want. And the analogy I sort of give to my students is, well, hold on a second. Is this actually free will, or did she do it? Like if I say to you, I really feel like a cheeseburger now. Like, oh, wouldn't a cheeseburger and fries be so nice right now? Like 10 minutes later, you're like, I actually feel like a cheeseburger. Like, did you make that choice, or is it because I planted that idea there? And then we also have Hermes, who leads them into the Greek camp itself. And so it's kind of like, hold on a second, you know, it's kind of like this little play, this little irony that Iris, irony, play on words even there.
Right.
It's funny that she plants this idea of chance in Priam's head, and he's all of a sudden like, oh yeah, it's my idea. You know, we have chance. It's like, did you think of that, or did someone else think of that for you?
Would you have just stayed in your, what does he say, 6 feet of, you know, of earth for the rest of time had Iris not visited him? And I mean, with this idea of the gods too, the queen believes her rule to be through God's divine will, because I think, and that comes up in the crown and in the queen.
Yeah.
She will rule until she dies, because she perceives that very much as her obligation. But she isn't supported perhaps by a god or a divine force in the same way that we know of, in the same way
that we see
Priam is. And I mean, is that just, I suppose that's the context, is it, that delineates that, you know, and a myth versus well, we say it, is it a myth, is it real? There's mythological elements.
I think definitely context comes into it. I mean, ancient Greek, we know that they definitely thought that the gods were controlling everything. They called on all these different gods for different reasons. Whereas 20th century Western culture, yes, we have different religions. We have Christians. We have a monarchy who believes that they're ordained by God still, but it's not, we don't believe necessarily that there are different gods that decide or guide different parts of our lives. You know, we as 20th and 21st century people in a modern society believe that, well, you know, a Western society, I should say, believe that we have free will and we're able to choose what we do. So again, a very, very, very different context to what we see in Ransom and the Queen. And I guess that's, you know, kind of why it's so controversial, this idea of chance that Priam brings to his wife Hecuba, and why she can't say it is because they're all like, hold on a second, you know, we have to believe in the gods. Hecuba says, you know, I can't even imagine what stuff would befall us if I said this word, you know, the ruin that would happen to our city. So definitely very, very different cultures and different views of the gods as well.
Unfortunately for Hecuba, very soon her whole city does fall. That's another.
Exactly.
That's another text.
I was going to say, I wonder if that's a foreshadowing.
Well, I was only just the other day talking about Women of Troy, which is about Hecuba after Troy has fallen. So, you know, perhaps there is this element of foreshadowing, and I think it's fair for students to have that understanding of the context, like you said, of the Iliad, in discussing Ransom. In the same way that we'd have understanding of the context of the Queen, we know what has happened before historically, and we know what will happen afterwards. Well, up until this point, we know that the monarchy has managed to reclaim in some way their, I don't want to say necessarily status, but their with William and Kate and Harry and Meghan, but you know, not that we'd want to put that in our our essays, but there is an understanding of like you said, we're talking about context, where the text is situated.
It is interesting. One of in class we looked at a tree, like a family tree of the monarchy, and they were like, hold on a second, notice how divorce only starts to happen after Diana divorces Charles. And I was like, That's actually a very interesting observation, because that's also when in our society divorce became more prevalent. You know, again, if you watch The Crown, you know, there's this controversy around divorce. Or we don't see that in the Queen at all, but there's definitely this controversy around divorce and not wanting to divorce, because if we're married, we have to stay married because we're the royal family and the monarch. And I just thought it was really interesting that one of the students pointed out, hold on a second, a lot more divorce seems to happen in this family tree after Charles and Diana divorced. So I don't know, maybe
it's a point of relevance, isn't there? Because in that, and maybe this is tenuous, and this is, I often say with my classes, tell me if I've pushed it too far. If I'm going, you know,
am
I reaching? But there is a point when the Queen's advisor says to, I think, Tony Blair, you need to understand the impact the abdication had on the Queen, because it pretty much signed her father's death warrant, because her father was never meant to be king. He only became king because her uncle abdicated to marry a woman who was divorced. So I think maybe understanding that context in why the Queen could be, to use a very modern word, triggered by Diana. And I think we can use that word triggered in a, you know, a non 21st century lingo way, that she is, by what Diana has done and how she impacted her family. Diana didn't maybe follow the rules in the same way the Queen did. She sacrificed so much for what she has perceived herself to sacrifice so much for people.
And we don't really know that from watching the Queen itself. We know that from historical events. Yes. When Princess Diana died, I was 7 years old, I think.
I was in Pizza Hut. I remember. I was
in Pizza Hut. Really?
Yeah, I'd just done Tournament of the Minds. Shout out to Tournament of the Minds, and I was in. I remember this so vividly. Back when you could get that all-you-can-eat Pizza Hut, and they had that great dessert bar.
Oh, that was so good. For those listening, you've probably never experienced an all-you-can-eat Pizza Hut. It was so good.
It was so. When it shut down, it was a travesty for all of Victoria and Australia. But
Sizzler. Sizzler was the same. Oh my gosh, Sizzler used to have the best bread. That's like the only reason I ever wanted to go to Sizzlers. Guys, you're missing out. Anyway,
this is what happens to English teachers when we stay up too late. Anyway, so what were we? Where do we? Yeah, Princess Diana's death.
Oh yeah, that's right. We only really know the impact she had because of history. We don't actually see that in the Queen herself. But Frears has actually chosen, anytime we see footage of Princess Diana or the people mourning, it is actual footage of Princess Diana and of the people mourning.
Yes, I wanted to touch on that. Thank you. Yeah, in fact, there's a lot of real footage of news reports Princess Diana's brother. That's actually him, isn't it? In the film, talking, Lord Spencer.
But even when the Queen gives her speech, when Tony Blair gives his speech, it's the actors themselves, but they give it that sort of staticky, grainy look to make it look like it's from then.
Yeah, but so there's that combination of,
I'm pretty sure all the real life footage, and we actually watched the Queen's speech side by side with the actual Queen's speech, and it is like pretty much spot on, exactly the same, which was really clever. I'm pretty sure all the real footage is around Diana and her death and the people mourning her death.
Yeah, what you're saying is this idea, this blurring of reality and fiction, which Ransom does as well in many ways, because Malouf has chosen a gap in the Iliad. So, you know, he's taken something, and you mentioned Somax being a fictional character within the realms of some real characters, and then we've got Frears with the beautiful merging of real archived footage and fiction. Because I think yes, go.
I was going to say, I'm just thinking, I wonder if the merging of the fiction and the real life is because maybe Frears is trying to say that we can't relive who Diana was. We can't we can't replicate her, we can't imitate her. She is who she was. I don't know. I wonder if there's something in that, because it's always, we don't have an actress playing her. So perhaps, you know, she was one of the royal family who didn't put on a facade. And, you know, one thing we could argue and say the Queen does is she puts on a facade. She looks at the dead stag and she's sad. We can see that. She turns around and she puts on a happy face for the, I forget who it is, but for the banker or whoever it is who hunted the stag.
Yes.
But Diana, she didn't put on that front. She didn't put on that face. And maybe that's why the Queen and Diana had all this conflict, is because the Queen was trying to keep her queen face, whereas Diana was trying to be, no, I'm me all the time, regardless of who I'm around.
Yes. Yes, I really like that. I like that. And so if that's what Frears was intending to do, because I think this is an interesting point about comparative too. You can have this point of similarity between the texts. So both texts, we could argue, a beautiful paragraph might be that both texts combine reality and fiction almost seamlessly to convey their story, perhaps.
Yeah.
And you've got the fact that Malouf has taken a very famous mythological tale, chosen a tiny gap in it, created a character in Somax that is false and his kind of own construction. And then you've got the real footage of Diana interspersed with Frear's own directed characters. So there's a point of similarity. But what's different, like you said there, is that what Frears was intending to do was to make this point about Diana not being able to be, I guess, recreated or mimicked in any way. She was too authentic, perhaps, as a character. But then my question would be also, what was Malouf intending to do? Because he's used a similar technique, but perhaps for a different intent.
Malouf is trying to say, we don't, I don't know, like there is a very fine line between who we are in our role and who we are shaped, or who we are as shaped by our identity, sort of thing. You know, our role doesn't necessarily define us. If we think of Priam, he wasn't born Priam. He was born Potices. I'm probably completely butchering these Greek names, but anyway.
Do you know what I always say? As long as you can spell it, I don't care.
That's what I say as well.
Yeah.
I've heard people say Priam, and then I've heard, like, the audio book says Priam, but then other people say Priam. So I like kind of just do whichever I feel like at the time.
I like that. I always say Priam, but I'm possibly wrong.
I say Priam. I don't know, whatever. As long as we know how to spell it, as you say.
Exactly.
So Priam was born Potices. He was born royal. And he retells this story to Hecuba, and it's in section 2, and it seems like something she's never heard of before, because Malouf describes her as being really uncomfortable hearing these things, like really uncomfortable hearing that Priam, who is this, you know, royal king of this awesome status, being a servant. So he, as Potices, was royal. Their town or their city got overtaken. His sister was kidnapped and taken as, we can assume, a sex slave. And those who took her basically said, you can have one gift that you can take with you. She looked at Potices, who was her brother, and she said, I want him, that's my brother. And they were like, haha, whatever, you can say he's your brother, I don't really care, but his name's going to be Priam, which means the price paid, which is also, you know, our definition of ransom. So Priam really, like, I feel like the message perhaps that Malouf is trying to convey is that your role does not define your identity, and your identity does not define your role. And I guess we could also see that in the Queen as well. And we don't need to just be looking at Priam and the Queen as monarchs and those in royalty. We could also be looking at people like Achilles. We could be looking at Somax. We could be looking at Tony Blair. But this idea, I feel like Priam has lived, like, he calls it a stench. He says he's lived with like this stench of being a slave boy for, you know, arguably only like a small amount of time in comparison to other people and in comparison to his reign in royal, like as a royal. But he talks about having this stench on him, like he's been a slave for a small amount of time, and then there's just this stench that he can't get rid of. And so I feel like Malouf is saying, you know, there's this contrast between who we are who we want to be and what we want to do and what people expect of us. And if we pull back and look at it like that, it's exactly what happens in the Queen. You know, Priam, for example, he wants to be more of a father. He says, in the last years of my reign, I want to do something meaningful. I need to go out as just a man, as a father, and I need to rescue Hector's body. And his sons, particularly Deiphobus, says, you know, this isn't your role. What would we do without you? You're our king. This isn't traditional. And Deiphobus gets teary as well. So it's not even that it's like something he's angry about. It's something that is like, no, this is how it is. This is your role. This is your status. This is how it should be. But Priam goes, no, hold on a second. I want to do something different though. I feel like I need to do something as a father rather than as a king. And I guess we also see that in the Queen as well. The Queen, instead of going with what the public wants her to do, she says, no, hold on a second. I'm a grandmother. I need to make sure my grandsons are okay. She says, I don't want them, when Diana first dies, she says, make sure the TV's not on. I don't want them to see that stuff on the news. So she's also conflicted with that role of a queen and a mother and a grandmother. But as I said before, though, I think in Priam's case, he is intrinsically motivated by this desire to be more of a father, to go out and do the unusual, whereas the Queen is extrinsically motivated by the people. She wants to keep this grief hidden. She says it's a family matter. It's private. Yet the people keep calling and saying, hold on a second, you're our monarch, you're our leader, you should be doing things this way.
And I wondered, I think too, you know, Priam is afforded the opportunity to go with Somax and have that time on his own to reflect and just be. Whereas when the Queen takes the family up to Scotland, that's perceived in such a negative way by the people.
That freedom.
Yeah. Even though we think to ourselves, oh, you know, I'd love to be the Queen. I wouldn't have to, I'd just be able to do what I like all the time. No, actually.
Not quite.
Not quite.
Because you have all those expectations of other people weighing on you all the time. Yeah.
And the pressure of that. You brought up the stag too before, and I want to loop back around because I think the stag is such in the Queen is such an interesting symbol.
Oh yes.
You know, it's the Prince Philip takes William and Harry. Also, we never see them in like, or we see them from very, very far away or from hidden. That's just another thing. As I watched, I realized
they're not very prominent at all.
No, and it's. I wonder. I'm curious, like why Frear's. Considering that the reaction that the Queen, I've left the stag. We're going to come back to it, but the reason the Queen is so intent on keeping this a private matter is for the benefit of the boys, and yet he doesn't represent the boys. Is he being respectful to the Queen?
I don't know. Is that like his way of going, this is how the Queen is being respectful? Like, because she wants it to be private, I'm going to keep them private, perhaps?
Yeah, I like that. As a side note, a sense of respect.
But I think also Malouf's main message, though, isn't necessarily about the boys. I think if we saw the boys, it would give a different insight. I think his message is mostly on how the Queen responded to Diana's death, and then how the Queen responded to Tony Blair coming into government, someone who's very young, someone who is part of a government who, you know, doesn't want the monarch there anymore. And I absolutely love it. Tony Blair recommends that the Queen goes and gives a speech. She does it. And he says she recommends that she put in her speech this line, and as a grandmother, and she does it. And I absolutely love the scene where he's sitting watching, and he's just like, oh, he's just like a little boy who's so infatuated, just watching her so eagerly. And she talks about how amazing she is. And Cherie is just like, no, she's cold, like she doesn't have a heart. She's cold-hearted. But Tony Blair's starting to see, and their relationship is starting to develop. And I guess if I sidetrack a little bit, we also then have this similarity of leaders. Leaders can't lead unless they've got someone to help them lead.
Yes. Okay.
So the Queen can't lead her people unless she has Tony Blair to help her. Tony Blair is the voice of the people. And I really love their first encounter. Tony Blair. I really don't like Cherie, though. I've got to say that. I really don't like Cherie. I feel like she's very like goody two-shoes. But
she's represented in a very static way too. She holds firm. She doesn't develop.
Unlike Tony Blair, definitely. So their first interaction is so awkward. They're like, okay, when you meet the Queen, you got to do this and this and this and this and this. And it's so awkward. And the most awkward part is first interaction when they're walking out, and Cherie is just like continuously curtsying and bowing as they're backing out to the door. And the Queen is just standing there. It's just so awkward. And we've got that really awkward first encounter juxtaposed, or I mean, perhaps we could even say mirrored at the very end. Once the Queen and Tony Blair's relationship has developed, they're no longer in the formal setting of the room where they meet. They're actually walking through the hallway and casually talking like two colleagues and two friends almost.
Equals.
So we really see, yeah, exactly. We really see that development. We see that Tony Blair has been able to come in and teach the Queen something. And I'm sure we could also argue vice versa. And we see that also with Priam and Somax. I absolutely love the relationship that we see between Somax and Priam. And I love the significance of the name that Somax is given. He's given the name Idias because Idias is the name of the King's Herald. The King's Herald being the person who goes and speaks on behalf of the King. It's just how it is. And Somax is grumpy. He's like, no, I'm not Idias. I'm not the King's Herald. I am Somax. Yeah, that's the name he is given. It's the title. It's the role he is given. I guess much like Priam and the Queen have their titles and their roles as leaders, as royals. And we find that throughout their journey, Somax teaches Priam a lot about fatherhood and about the simple things in life. These griddle cakes, which are just essentially pancakes, Priam eats them and they're absolutely amazing. And he can't believe that someone has just made these out of a few ingredients. Priam is described as very childlike. He's described as a kid putting his feet in the stream, into the water. And previous to that, in section 2, he and Hecuba described as two old people. Yeah. 2 old people sitting as children. So there's still like this this naivety. And so with the Queen, I guess we've got this naivety of she doesn't quite understand how to work in this modern context. And with Priam, we've got this naivety of I've been so stuck in my royal sphere for so long that I actually didn't realize that a father could be like this. And so Priam teaches him this stuff along the way. And I think the childlike imagery in Ransom is really significant because children are naive, they're ignorant, they learn. And Somax has that. And then continuing on with this idea of Somax being the herald, being Idias, it's interesting because the herald is meant to speak on behalf of the king there and then. So if it was done traditionally, Somax would be the one going into Achilles and talking to Achilles on behalf of Priam, but he doesn't do that. But you know where he does do that is when he tells Priam's story at the end of the novel. And Priam lives on in that legacy that Somax creates. So even though Somax doesn't necessarily, and everyone's like, oh, we don't believe it's Somax because it wasn't Somax who did it. It was this guy called Idias, you know? So even though Somax doesn't fulfill necessarily that role of Idias and telling that story on the journey itself, he fulfills that role later. And he plays a pivotal role, I would say, in keeping Priam's legacy and Priam's story alive.
Yeah.
So we've got these 2 leaders who need to be supported by other people. A leader cannot lead without being supported by others. And I think that is definitely something that both texts teach us. A leader is still teachable. A leader who is older is still teachable because both of Priam and the Queen are older than Somax and Blair.
And yet there's still so much that they can learn.
Can I touch on some of the really cool ideas that I feel my students have come out with.
I would love that.
One thing we talked about, and you mentioned it before and we didn't touch on it, was the stag.
Yes, okay.
The symbol of the stag. So one thing my students, and I never thought about this until we were like brainstorming stuff. One person was like, oh, maybe the stag is a symbol for Diana. Maybe the stag symbolizes Diana and the relationship that they had, or perhaps the relationship that she had with the media. They do say that it was death by media. So she was like, maybe we could talk about the stag as being symbolic of Diana. And then others were like, hold on a second, but the stag could also be symbolic of the queen. You know, the queen is the scene where she sees, so firstly, this stag is being hunted. This stag is being hunted, ironically, by Prince Philip and the two sons. I actually find it really weird that the thing Prince Philip does to comfort his grandsons after their mother's death is to go out and kill a creature. I just find that super ironic.
That's meant to be a reflection of how traditional he is. Like, he's very old school. Possibly. He's like, let's get them outside in the fresh air and they won't be grieving their mother anymore. And it's like, Philip, I think, maybe.
Possibly. Yeah. Or is it possibly it might be a stretch, but a reflection on how the royal family maybe killed Diana or added to her death?
Big. That's a big one. Right?
You probably have to validate that a little bit more, but hey, the idea's there now.
I mean, could the stag have multiple symbolic interpretations depending on the argument we're willing to make?
And that's something we've discussed. So we've discussed the stag as being symbolic of Diana, the stag as being symbolic of the queen. So this idea of it being hunted, you know, just like the stag is being hunted, the queen is also is essentially being hunted by her people. They want her to do something in a particular way. So when the stag dies, it's kind of like, okay, I've got to die. Like, my traditional views need to die along with the stag. I need to, you know, step up and do something else.
Yes. I love that. That gives me little tingles up my.
So what we did is I got my students to do a close analysis of an excerpt from each text, and these were some of the ideas that were coming out in their analyses. Another really good idea. So that was the stag. We had a few different ideas of the stag. Another comparison we made was that self-actualization in both texts happens in the wild, happens in nature. So in the Queen, and it's also kind of really cool that the Queen was a mechanic in the war, and she drives this Jeep and she's like bush bashing with her Jeep and she gets stuck. Something a student suggested today is, like, the Queen gets out of the Jeep. She knows what's wrong with it. She says, oh, I know what's wrong with it. I just can't fix it. And they were like, maybe that's actually symbolic of that. She knows what's wrong with the society at the moment, with the way she's grieving and dealing with it, or the way that she's responded. And she knows how to fix it, but she needs someone else's help. And I was like, that's actually really cool. I like that connection. But it's also kind of cool that the Queen, who we like think of as this hoity-toity character, is riding a Jeep through like the bush. So she gets out of this Jeep, and that's where she sees this stag that she's heard Philip talk about hunting. And she says it is this beautiful creature. It is magnificent. And so it's kind of, and that's when we see her first emotion on her face. So it's in nature that we sort of start to see her actually show that emotion. One student pointed out that if you look at the camera angles in the car, the camera angles are close. So she's really constricted and confined. So she's constricted and confined perhaps to her tradition and her roles. But when she's out in the wild, yes, we have some close-up shots, but we also have these really long shots showing her in her environment. And Priam is exactly the same when he is in nature. Another thing we thought about was this idea of water. Water washes away. It renews, it cleans. Ironically, the Jeep gets stuck in the water, and that's where she sees the stag. We could talk about the Jeep and the stag both as symbols. Priam puts his feet in the water like a child. And I wonder if, or something that the students reflected on was, is this maybe like a symbol for the washing away of his old self, the washing away of what he thought a father should be, or what he had been doing as a father, and coming to this new realization. So it seems that in both texts we've got this setting of nature where they come to some sort of self-actualization, some sort of realization about where they need to be. One student said, and I thought this was a really interesting point that I'd need to think about a little more, that the people helping Diana, so for example, not Diana, sorry, the Queen. For example, we've got that really cute picture when the Queen finally goes back to Buckingham Palace. There's this little girl holding up a bouquet of flowers, and the Queen is like, oh, do you want me to put that in the pie for you? And the little girl's like, no, that's for you. Like, we've got this childhood innocence coming across again. Priam also has that childhood innocence. So we've got this childhood innocence coming across again. So one thing that a student said was that the people helping the Queen suggests that perhaps the way they're grieving is incorrect. You know, people saying to the Queen, this is how it should be done, is their way of saying the way you're grieving is incorrect. That's not how we want. And so I guess ultimately that comes back to the extrinsic motivation, how she's driven more by the public.
You know, when that little girl gives her the flowers. No, that's such a beautiful scene, and
it was so
and the close up of the Queen's face afterwards, and the realization that she can still maybe connect with her people. She's very disconnected from her people throughout much of the film, and she's in those huge ornate rooms, and she's having her cups of tea, and she, you know.
That's where that idea of a figurehead comes in, because a figurehead really is someone who is symbolic. Priam, while yes, he is a figurehead, I feel like in a war setting, in the historical context, he would have had a lot more control, a lot more leadership, a lot more say in stuff that happens. Whereas I feel like the Queen is definitely more that figurehead, that symbol. She represents you know, royalty, she represents a monarchy, she represents reign, but she doesn't really have much say in stuff. Like Tony Blair comes to her and says, I think we should do this, and you know, she might get some say, but it's not like her word is the final word.
Did you come up with any, is there a correlating symbol? I've got Priam washing his feet. I'm wondering,
so the symbol of nature and water
with the stag. I know that there's been lots of work. I've read of stuff to do with the two mules and the roles of them. I wondered if you'd had a conversation about that.
So I'm going to try and remember. So they were talking about the mules, and firstly, I find the names of the mules really interesting, Beauty and Shock. So the only thing that people really remember about the man who took Priam to Achilles is the donkey that he had, Beauty. Now it's kind of, I find it so interesting because Beauty is actually the reason one of Somax's sons died. And Somax basically says, you know, the creature didn't know any better. Very, very interesting. If we think about our context now, like if someone's dog attacks someone and they're injured or died, the dog's put down, you know, we don't sort of sympathize necessarily with the pet. So very, very interesting. But then the other donkey's name, who's not actually mentioned much, is Shock. So it's very interesting, the contrast in names. But they did make a connection between the stag and the mule. So I guess if we're wanting to draw some sort of similarity, the similarity would be that perhaps both texts, and again, this is where we go similarity but difference. Both texts use the symbol of nature, and both texts use animals as symbols. Okay, that's our similarity. In the Queen, we've got the stag, and then in Ransom, we've got the mules as well as Jove's eagle, which is mentioned as a guiding force. So maybe it's kind of, it might be easier to link Jove's eagle with the stag. I mean, I guess arguably we could say that the stag maybe guides the Queen in a way to her self-realization, her self-actualization, the need to modernize. Just as Jove's eagle, like the point of Jove's eagle is to guide the people. And again, that could also come down to this idea of the gods controlling and the gods guiding.
I like that idea that, you know, that there's a point of similarity in that both texts are utilizing animals as symbolic imagery, because, you know, they could have chosen many other things to use as symbolic. And the combination of the animals providing guidance and the water, I love that idea, the water washing away, renewing, Priam washing his feet, and the Queen sitting by the river and the Jeep maybe versus the cart, I wonder as well, you know, that idea of being
I like that.
Yeah. And I think what we're demonstrating here is you can just pick two things and put them against each other and go, okay, well, what is similar here and what is different? And don't be scared of the different, I think, as well. We're not looking just for an essay or for an interpretation that only purely focuses on what is similar. We're really looking for what is also different.
Yeah, I feel like I need to record my English sessions all the time, because I feel like there's all these really good things that come across and I just don't get a chance to record them.
You know what I often would tell my students is to always have a pen in your hand in English, because if and when someone says something amazing, you write it down. You write that down and you use it. In the same way that I hope they're listening to this podcast with a pen in their hand, writing down all the amazing analytical points that we've come to.
We've got this really interesting motif of Somax rubbing his nose. I don't know if you picked up on that. So it seems like every time he's nervous or there's something awkward that happens, he rubs his nose. I'm not sure, I haven't been able to think of anything in the Queen that we could relate this to, but because the Queen is very emotionless. The only time we see her with any sort of emotion is when no one else is looking, or when she's out in the environment in nature by herself. So I wonder if, I don't know, like the difference could be that we've got a character, Somax, who like shows his emotion or nervousness, maybe. I don't know, might need to think about that one a little bit more. Then we got the symbol of the griddle cakes, like simplicity. There is something good to be said about simplicity. In the Queen, we've got the painting of the Queen, like it's the perfect picture. You know, a painting and a photo is like meant to be a perfect point in time, sort of thing. Definitely we've got this like this childishness perhaps coming across, or this childlike ignorance, this learning.
I definitely got the idea that the Queen learned quite a lot, and Priam learns an incredible amount in Ransom, but that the Queen learns
Priam
a lot.
sobs at the end.
Yeah, she definitely does learn through her experiences, whether she wants to or not. You know who we haven't talked about? Charles.
Achilles.
How does he fit in your conversations?
A little bit, not a whole lot. We don't see Charles a whole lot. We see him at the start when Diana dies and Charles asks if he can take the private jet, and the Queen is basically like, no, you can't. It's not a royal matter, so you can't take the royal jet, you have to go commercial. So we've got that, that's like the first sort of interaction I guess we see. We see him a little bit afterwards, and he does talk to Tony Blair, and he does sort of instigate with Tony Blair about having a funeral for Diana and having a procession and doing the flag half-mast and all that sort of jazz. So we do see him a little bit.
He's an advocate for progression, though, isn't he? He wants...
Yeah. But I wonder how much influence he actually has over the Queen. Like, he's definitely there as a support for Blair. But I think if we were to, like, mind map it and make, like, a hierarchy or whatever, I don't think Charles would have much influence in trying to convince the Queen, because it's his mum. Like, I think there's just that family dynamic. So I think Charles going to Tony Blair, like, Charles going to Tony Blair, maybe he's also kind of saying that he's also one of the people. You know, if we talk about Tony Blair as being a symbol for the people, a representative of the people, Charles going to Tony Blair, maybe Charles is like, I want to be the voice of the people as well, perhaps. Yeah, we don't see him a whole lot.
He's worried about being shot. I remember that. You know, he's really worried about being assassinated.
Yes, yeah. So there's that constant fear. There's that move toward progression. We also have Prince Philip as well. And something that my students pointed out was every time we see Prince Philip, he was always so negative. It's like a negative Nelly. He's like always complaining about what's on the TV, or like complaining to the Queen about something that's happening. Like he's like supportive in a way of the Queen in wanting to stick to her traditional roles and rules and regulations and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But he does it in a very negative way. Like it just seems like he's always complaining about something. I would definitely say Charles, though, is like he helps with the instigation of change, but he knows he's not going to be able to influence the Queen, so he goes to Tony Blair and he says, "You've got my full support."
It's almost like Charles is a catalyst, but Philip's a hindrance.
Yeah, definitely. But it's also, I guess, about going to the right people to make change. So I guess Charles knows that it's assumed that maybe Charles knows going straight to his mother is not going to make any sort of difference. She's not going to listen to him. But going to Tony Blair, who's in that position, she will listen. So I wonder if it's also maybe about, again, I guess it comes back to roles, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
The roles we have and the expectations people have of us in our roles.
Yeah.
Someone else we didn't talk about was Achilles. So poor Achilles, he loses Patroclus. We have the symbolism of Achilles' armor. So Patroclus goes out in Achilles' armor, he's killed, and they've obviously had that tiff beforehand. And so, you know, Achilles is just filled with this grief. And he says, you know, he's waiting for, he's waiting for the rage to fill him that will assuage his grief.
It's partially why he does all those awful things too, doesn't he? Like he wants to consume his grief.
Yeah. He doesn't know how to deal with it.
No.
And I find it so funny that, well, maybe not funny, but, you know, he desecrates Hector's body every night, and then the gods come in and renew it. And it's kind of like, maybe they're like, hold on, Achilles. You know, I know you are half immortal. You know, your mum was, you know, goddess of the sea.
Yep.
But you're not a god, and you don't have control over Hector's body. You know, this is not what's going to help you in your grief. And so it's kind of like, you know, I wonder if it's like a taunting almost by the gods of Achilles. You know, this is not how you're going to assuage your grief. And then we have that. So he struggles with his grief, and I think I spoke previously about how even though he is desecrating the body and breaking daily every rule that they've been taught to live by, his myrmidons still love him. And then in contrast to the public and the Queen. And then we have that really sweet moment when Priam comes in, and Achilles is described as being in his room, and he's described as being in like a corner, in a half-lit corner. It's dim, you know, sort of mimicking his mood. He doesn't want to eat, but his myrmidons are like sitting there enthusiastically waiting for him to start eating so they can start eating. Yeah. And then he like takes a bite, and then Alchemist, who is like the young person who doesn't quite know the protocol yet, he like shoves his mouth with food, and everyone looks at him, and then he's like described as like maidenly, like putting his stuff down. I find that the funniest part. And then Priam comes in, and Achilles almost thinks that it's his father. Like initially he thinks it's his father, and so they're able to connect on this level of fatherhood. And I find it so touching that Achilles says to Priam, if you ever need help, you can call on me. This is the enemy. Yeah. Like he says to the enemy, if you ever need help, you can call on me. And then as we know later on, Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, kills Priam.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just find that really, really sweet. And that, I guess for me, that sort of brings up these ideas of fatherhood. And, you know, Achilles, he was away from his father, so he never really got to develop that relationship. He talks about there's a contrast between a dual self, being a father and a farmer. And then interestingly, Priam in section 2 is described as in exactly the same way as also having a dual self. So it's like Malouf is trying to create a connection between these two enemies before they actually meet. And then when they finally meet, they connect on this level of grieving as a father. Because Achilles doesn't see his father. He also doesn't see his son Neoptolemus, because Neoptolemus is away with Peleus in his grandfather. And so we see this big idea of fatherhood and what it means to be fatherhood, and I guess the loss of fatherhood. And that's ultimately how they connect. And I think that's ultimately how Achilles' grief is assuaged. I wonder if we can connect that to the Queen somehow, because she does talk about being a grandmother. And so I wonder if we could connect this idea of coming to the realization of what it means to be a father and to have the role, like the role of a father in grief. I don't know, like I think there's a connection that could be made there, because I feel like the Queen adding in that line, and as a grandmother, shows the familial values that she has. And looking, like going back through the movie, her motivation is that she doesn't want to upset her grandchildren. So she does have that familial motivation, I guess.
That idea that Priam and Achilles are positioned as in opposition to each other and yet have similarities. That maybe the Queen and Tony Blair as well, you know, initially positioned as in opposition, but they both they actually have something that they can learn from each other.
And we see both of them in their family environments as well.
Yeah,
we see Tony Blair in his very messy modern house with, you know, their crowded kitchen. Sorry?
Eating fish fingers for dinner.
Yeah, exactly. Which, you know, I'm kind of like, shouldn't the Prime Minister be earning a little bit more than that and be able to afford more than fish fingers? But anyway.
Listen, when you've got kids and you've got to put dinner on the table, like, it's just fish fingers, you know, right?
That's fair. Yeah, because we see that definite contrast, like the messy kitchen, the messy house, and then the Queen's like all this formal stuff behind her, the fancy books and everything. Yeah.
So they're both constructed as oppositions. There's a two like sense of like mirror images, and yet, despite that, there's points of similarity between them, points of connection that they maybe would never, that each of them would never have predicted. You know, Priam would never have predicted that Achilles would be able to see, they'd be able to see eye to eye. Just as I don't think the Queen considers, perhaps evidenced by the fact that she does wrap up their first meeting, awkward as it is, purposefully. She asks her attendant to come in and say, oh, you've got a very important phone call, you know, just because she was like, was that long enough? I didn't want to, you know, she didn't want to have the conversation with him either. I like that. There's kind of like a comparison within a comparison. It's like,
bam, that's what comparison is all about.
It is. I wonder if that brings us really nicely. So it's funny how this happens. The conversation gets to a point. It brings us really nicely to the last question I will ask you, Hannah, which is, what's the point of these texts? Why has the VCAA put them together?
That's a hard question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, I feel like all the questions I've asked you tonight have been hard. But it is hard because there's possibly a multitude of answers. So obviously keeping in mind that as a teacher, you and I, as teachers, we have our own individual perspective and interpretation. But I think, you know, if students were thinking about the overall purpose of the two texts and how they function within their contexts and what they say about leadership, we've talked about grief and leadership and the gods, the responsibility of leaders and how they need support. Why are we studying these texts?
Yeah, I think it's kind of what I've already touched on. If you were like, okay, what's the big overarching thing these two texts have? I would say, well, ultimately, it's the role of the dual self, the role of leaders versus their like, maybe it's like a conflict of roles, perhaps, is the best way of saying it. The conflict of being a leader versus the conflict of being part of a family, being a father, being a mother. Yeah, I think I would say ultimately it's this idea of the conflict of roles and expectations as well. Because when someone is labeled as having a role, we have expectations of them. And I guess it's also kind of like the higher up we are, the what's the word? Like the further we have to fall as well. And in both instances, in both texts, the higher they are, Priam has a long way to fall. Priam going from king to a mere man in a normal cart carried by mules, which, as one of my students pointed out today, is just an ugly horse. You know, it's just uncalled for. And then the Queen as well, if the people, 1 in 4 people said that they didn't want a monarchy, if that happens, I'm sorry, monarchy gone, you know. So I would say ultimately the role of leaders and the struggle that they have with this dual self and the expectations that other people have on them. And one thing I would encourage people, like students, to do who are listening to this, don't be scared to share your ideas, and don't be scared to talk with other students about it as well. Like in our classes, my students have come up with stuff that I'm an English teacher, doesn't mean I have every single idea there is about every single text.
Same. Yeah.
I absolutely love having students come up with ideas that I haven't even thought about, and then being able to talk through it with them and sorting out, you know, how can we validate it? How can we support it? So don't be afraid to get into little study groups and share ideas. Even if you want to get in touch with students who aren't even part of your school, get ideas from other schools, because I'm sure that other teachers and other schools have had other things, different things that they've been able to pull out. So don't be scared to share your ideas. If it can't be validated or supported, that's fine. At least we tried. I know there's times in class as a teacher where I've said something and I'm like, actually, no, I don't like that. I'm going to scrap that. Forget that. You know, and that's perfectly fine. That's all part of the process. It's all part of the learning process. So yeah, don't be scared to share ideas, and don't be scared to get into groups and to discuss ideas.
I totally agree. This has been such a pleasure, Hannah. Thank you so much. I don't know if you want to give a shout out to your school. I didn't even offer you that.
Oh, that's all right.
Shout out to your kids.
Before I do a shout out though, what I will say though is that I actually do not like reading. I do not read for fun. The last book I read for fun was Tim Winton's The Riders, and it was so disappointing that I was like, and this was like, I don't know, like 6 years ago or something. I was like, I can't believe I read this for fun. Like, the last series I read for fun was Harry Potter when I was like 15, 16. I don't read for fun. You give me a book and you say, hey, read this. It's a good book. I'll be like, no thanks. You give me a book and you say, you got to teach a year 12 class. You got to teach someone this book. You got to analyze it. Yeah, I'm all over it.
Yeah. Because analysis is an action. It's not just a passive enjoyment of a text. It actually doesn't even matter if you like the text. What matters is, can you extrapolate meaning?
Exactly. And again, that's a something that you can take, like that's a skill that you are going to use in anything that you do beyond school. So you do not have to enjoy reading to be able to analyze and explore and express ideas. I absolutely love analyzing stuff. I just don't enjoy reading for fun. I think maybe it's also because I'm the sort of person whose mind is always working and ticking. So when I read something, like I need to have something to also be thinking about while I'm reading. So yeah, you don't have to enjoy reading to analyze.
Words of wisdom. Wisdom. Absolutely.
And then also shout out to my school, Melton Christian College, and to my year 11 and 12 students, although I don't even know if any of my year 12 students will be listening to this, but thanks for all the ideas, guys.
Yeah, appreciate it. And hopefully we'll get a bit of traction on the Instagram or the Facebook pages at Teachers Talk Texts. Definitely, if you're listening to this and you have questions, jump on and share them. Ask Hannah or myself any questions so we can prepare perhaps our next conversation with some more specific areas. Or if you have anything you want to share, if you're listening and you're a teacher right now and you got a different perspective, we'd love to hear that, because I think, you know, we've talked about so much today, but there's so much more we could.
For sure. And if you disagree with anything, do it, discuss it. You don't have to agree with everything that I've said or with everything anyone else says. What the examiners are looking for and what we're looking for as teachers is that you're able to support your ideas. Even if we don't agree, we're able to go, you've got this idea and you've actually supported it, even though I don't necessarily agree with it, but you supported it, and that's what matters.
You're right. I love it. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your insights and your wisdom and your perspective. And thank you by extension to your students for their fabulous insights, because yeah, island.